When I awoke, I heard sobbing. My head ached and my throat burned. I looked around to gather my surroundings. The remains of a small campfire lay before me. He told me I was his bride. I looked over to see Zoe sobbing into her knees. I had no idea what she meant. I just lay there watching her, confined to my own thoughts. I felt useless, used, dirty, nothing. I was nothing. I realized we were no longer in front of the house. The area looked more like one of the campsites littering our woods. It was still dark. Zoe? I started, but I had nothing to say. I realized how cold I was. I slowly stood, completely sore, and walked over to Zoe and put my arms around her. She finally seemed to realize I was there, held me tight, and cried. To this day, I have never heard or felt such anguish that was in that clearing that night. She cried, then I cried. We must have sat there holding onto each other for hours before we finally mustered the courage to stand. Upon examining our surroundings, I realized how dark it was, how alone we were. At least, I thought we were. At the other side of the dead campfire was one of the robed figures. He was laying with his back rolled against a large sitting log. We cautiously approached the figure. When we inspected more closely, we saw that the man's ribcage had been torn open. The inside of his chest was completely exposed. His face bore a solid red mask. If I had seen this gruesome sight only hours ago, I would have screamed. I would have cried. But I was not the same girl I had been hours ago. I was nothing. I became aware that Zoe was holding my hand. I looked at her and she seemed to have regained some of her strength. Okay? She asked. Yeah, I responded. Let's go home. Having been in the woods a lot, I had a pretty good idea of where people like to camp. This gave me a rough idea of where we were. I picked a direction and we started walking. For about a half hour, we just walked silently, hand in hand. Eventually, I heard Zoe say, I'm so sorry I dragged us out here, Bex. We stopped and I faced her. I wanted to scream that it was her fault. I wanted to scream that it wasn't her fault. But I had nothing. I was nothing. Instead, I just said, all right. It was shortly after, through the brush, we saw a huge bright light in the sky. The moonlight! I could hear Zoe's smile as she said it. Then I heard it. It started as a noise off in the distance. Crunching, trampling, pounding. It sounded like some large animal was charging through the forest straight at us. We didn't wait to see it. I looked down and took Zoe's dark hand and started running harder than I ever had. After our ordeal, I didn't think we could run like that anymore. We charged recklessly through the brush, but despite our haste, the stomping behind us grew louder. The pounding was now accompanied by a monstrous roar. A roar which would send beast of any kind fleeing in terror. The moonlight grew brighter. I could see the edge of the tree line and feel the heat of hot breath against my neck. The rancid air smelled of rotten eggs and fire. I burst forth from the woods like a swimmer out of water, grasping for air, keep charging forward with every ounce of my strength before collapsing under the gorgeous majesty of the moonlight. In that exact moment, I thought, I'll die here. The sound had stopped. I just lay there panting. I was cut and bruised from my charge through the brush. I was bleeding. We'd experienced the worst trauma imaginable, but Zoe and I had made it out alive. My hand was empty. Zoe? I asked through panting breaths. Zoe! I looked around, but she was nowhere. Zoe! I thought I couldn't possibly cry any more tears. I was nothing, after all. The tears started to come freely nonetheless. I stood feebly. The woods, I thought. I started to walk towards the woods to find Zoe when I saw it. Just inside the tree line was a massive silhouette, easily 15 feet tall. The shadow seemed to be heaving, exhausted from its chase. Right in the spot where eyes would be were two glowing red orbs. His eyes. In those deep crimson eyes, I felt pain. I felt longing, anger, suffering, hatred, but most of all, evil. Whatever this creature was, a demon, a god, the devil himself, he wanted me. It felt the pull of its lustful desire for me at a time when I should have had no understanding of what that meant. I was not meant to escape. I stared for a minute, cursing whatever it was that stood in front of me, hating it. However, faced with this evil forth the depths of hell, I was filled with even more terror than fury. Suddenly, the entire tree line flashed red, then blue, then red again. I heard a car pull up and screech to a halt behind me. I turned to see a police car. I looked back at the tree line, but the shadow was gone.